This week on Jerusalem Dateline, just days after being indicted, Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu faces political threats from within and without. Plus, Iranians take to the streets and call for the overthrow of the regime. And CBN's Scott Ross examines the growing Iranian presence near the strategic Golan Heights, why Israelis want to live there. And a look inside the world's fastest growing church, how Iranians are coming to faith. All this and more this week on Jerusalem Dateline. Hello and welcome to this edition of Jerusalem Dateline. I'm Chris Mitchell. Just days after his indictment, Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu got hit with challenges from within his own party. This as Israel prepares for a possible third election within the last 12 months. And Netanyahu faces the fight of his political life. As Netanyahu plans for another likely bitter campaign, he assured Israelis he would abide by any court decision while continuing to criticize his investigators.
We'll always act according to the rule of law, and that means that whoever didn't act in accordance with the law, in the police or the state prosecutor, it needs to be looked into, dealt with, and corrected.
Benny Gantz, the leader of the main opposition party, demanded Netanyahu retire to fight his legal battles and appeal to the prime minister's own party.
This is the only way to prevent unnecessary elections, which only one person wants, contrary to the will of the people, contrary to the needs of the people. Leaders of the Likud, it's time to make your voice heard.
Gidon Sar, a Netanyahu rival inside Likud, demanded new elections within the party. Netanyahu agreed on Sunday to hold those elections within the next 6 weeks to determine who will lead the party next. It's a risky move with an uncertain outcome. While the politicians maneuver, the court of public opinion remains divided.
The charges against him are pretty severe, and his response to the charges showed that he is incapable of functioning in a rational way or carrying out any serious decision-making.
I'll be happy to know that this is fiction and not true, and that Bibi will continue his term, because Bibi, in my eyes, is one of the best statesmen and politicians in the world.
Israel now faces an unprecedented legal situation.
Other legal systems do not accept this scenario, and it remains to be seen whether in Israel we will really face this very exceptional, unusual scenario of a person who is at the same time the Prime Minister of Israel and an accused person in very serious charges.
For Netanyahu, the crucial date is December 11th. Until then, if any of the Knesset members can gather 61 seats, they can form a government. Given the legal shadow over Netanyahu, it's possible members of various parties could join together to form a government and choose a new prime minister. Within the past few weeks, massive street demonstrations have rocked Iran. What began as protests against the rise in fuel prices have grown to calls for the downfall of the regime itself. But the Islamic Republic remains Israel's #1 enemy and a threat to the entire Middle East. Beginning in Tehran and spreading throughout Iran, demonstrators have flooded the streets with shouts of death to Iran's supreme leader Khamenei and down with the regime.
This regime is extremely harsh, is extremely brutal.
Shahzavar Karimzadeh, an Iranian-born economist from London, says the regime survives through brutality, but believes outside help could make it fall.
At the moment, we got to the point that this regime is towards the end of his life. And that's why there is a need really for the help from all democratic nations, democratic governments, to help the people in Iran to get rid of this regime.
Iran blames the U.S. for the demonstrations.
We consider the support they have given as interference in Iran's internal affairs and in line with their hostile policies and maximum pressure that American officials are pursuing.
Secretary of State Mike Pompeo responded.
The Iranian people are once again on the streets because of the regime's poor economic management. And instead of addressing their grievances, Tehran has responded with violence and by blaming those outside of the country. Courageous people of Iran who refuse to stay silent about 40 years of abuse by the ruling regime, I say simply this: the United States hears you, we support you, and we will continue to stand with you in your struggle for a brighter future for your people and for your great nation.
Despite its internal unrest, Israeli Prime Minister Netanyahu warns Iran's military goals remain the same.
Iran's aggressions in our region and in front of us continues. We are taking all necessary steps to prevent Iran from settling here in the region. It also includes the activities needed to thwart deadly weapons transfers from Iran to Syria, whether by air or ground.
Israel not only faces growing Iranian threats next to the Golan Heights, but also from Lebanon by Iran's proxy Hezbollah. After Iran's recent attack against Saudi Arabia, the U.S. commander in the Middle East, General Kenneth McKenzie, issued this warning and said, "In my judgment, it is very possible that Iran will attack again." So while Iran fights internal dissent, it remains a menace in the region and may mean another showdown is looming in the Middle East. One showdown already underway in the Middle East is the nearly 2-month-old Turkish invasion of northeast Syria. It's displaced hundreds of thousands of Syrians, and with winter just weeks away, some are warning of a humanitarian crisis. These are the sounds of the ceasefire in northeast Syria. This battle is in a place called Ain Issa, where jihadist forces backed by the Turkish army attacked a refugee camp.
This is the shooting of the Turks and Free Syrian Army trying to come into Ain Issa. And this is a terrible invasion that has not stopped yet.
Dave Eubank and his Free Burma Rangers team have been on the front lines and documenting the fighting and the humanitarian crisis.
These are some of the 300,000 people who fled the attack of the Turks and the Free Syrian Army now.
About 15,000 Syrian refugees have sought refuge inside northern Iraq, while the rest remain inside Syria. But both groups face the upcoming winter cold, where temperatures can get below freezing, in tents that often have no heat. Relief agencies warn some inside Syria don't have clean drinking water, and many need emergency shelter, food, and fuel. It's part of the humanitarian crisis that began with Turkey's invasion in early October. Up next, CBN's Scott Ross takes a look at the growing Iranian threat to Israel's strategic Golan Heights. When President Trump recognized Israeli sovereignty over the Golan Heights, Israel thanked him by naming a community after him. But who would want to live so close to a hostile Syrian border with Iran trying to attack? CBN's Scott Ross visited the Golan Heights recently and met some Israelis who say they wouldn't want to live anywhere else.
And what are we looking at here from this point of view?
So the Sea of Galilee is down, straight down here. Right in front of you, you have the mountains of Tiberias. Right after them, behind them, you have the mountains of Nazareth. And then as you go to the right, to the north, you get to the Upper Galilee. And of course, this is where most of the Gospels took place, around the Sea of Galilee.
Amitai Elon owns a holiday village called Natur at the top of the Sea of Galilee on the Golan Heights.
Why have you chosen to live here?
If you want to live in nature, surrounded by beautiful nature and the sound of birds, you can go to the Golan, Galilee, and you can go to the Negev desert.
Now this is a farm.
So it's a farm, it's a space that we use for a lot of things. We're sitting right now in a geodesic dome that is a greenhouse. Sometimes it will hold an event, a venue, or a party, or a camping of a big family. It's kind of magical.
But as beautiful and peaceful as it is, the borders of Lebanon and Syria run along the Golan Heights. Iran, too, is trying to set up bases on the Syrian side nearby from which to attack Israel.
How far are you from the Syrian border?
Very close.
There's no threat from the other side?
Except for 67 war and 73 war, this place has been the safest in the country.
Have you grown more apprehensive since Iran has gained a bigger foothold near the Israeli Golan?
If you look at the big picture of the history of this place, thousands of years, we had extremely ups and extremely downs, but we're here.
Further north, we visited security expert Kobi Maron, who was the former Israeli military commander on the Golan Heights and now lives here.
With the unstable situation in Syria, with the Iranian deployment, it's critical for Israel to be here in the Golan Heights and stay here, because with so many challenges, I can't think about the situation that we could be on the 67 line.
Israel captured the Golan Heights in 1967 during the last 2 days of the Six-Day War. The Israeli-Syrian border along the Golan is about 55 miles long. Are you under a constant threat here?
We feel very safe. The Israeli deterrence is very effective. The Iranian regime had a project. They plan to have here across the border 100,000 Shiite militias with the Hezbollah. They plan to have Air Force bases, Navy bases, intelligence centers. They plan to have an advanced industry to produce precise missiles that can be a real threat for the center of Israel and the strategic spots of Israel. So that's why we saw in the last 3-4 years that Israel attacked this Iranian deployment and destroy, and we become very successful.
Some 50,000 people, more than half Jewish Israelis, live on the Golan Heights, but internationally it's considered occupied territory. In March 2019, however, President Trump broke with tradition and recognized the strategic heights as part of Israel. Israel named the community in his honor, calling it Trump Heights.
It's a dramatic statement. It's unbelievable. It's so important for positive, sure. A significant declaration because it came from the strongest and the most important Israeli allies, United States. With the Trump recognition about the Golan Heights, there is a big challenge for the next Israeli government. I think we have to bring 100,000 Israelis to the Golan Heights in the next 10 years.
I met Eliyahu Berkowitz in Katzrin, the largest city on the Golan Heights. He immigrated to Israel 28 years ago from New Jersey and moved to the Golan about 7 years ago. Are you at all intimidated by the events surrounding Israel and specifically the Golan?
We're always worried about Israel, but there's a lot to be optimistic about. I don't know what people think of the Golan. They built bomb shelters here when they first settled it, and they've never been used.
Known in the Bible as Bashan, some 635,000 tourists visited the Golan Heights last year, 3/4 of them Christians, to see its stunning views, historical sites, and wineries.
We've always been alone, and when I see Christians interested in Israel, that's something totally new. It gives me incredible optimism. I'm very happy about it. I think I'm helping them to be better Christians, and they're certainly helping me to be a better Jew.
What way?
Because I want to stay here in Israel, and they're helping that. And also, I'm not here just for me. I'm here for the whole world. The Torah was given at Mount Sinai, and we were supposed to be a light unto the nations. If you keep it to yourself, then you're breaking it.
Ilan, who is also a tour guide, summed up Christian commitment to Israel and the Golan Heights.
If you came here between 2000 and 2005, we had kind of an intifada happening here. It was empty, except for Christians.
Why do you think that is?
That is the perspective, that's all. Your connection to the land, is this from the Bible, or is it from CNN, or from a narrow perspective of few years of troubles? If you're connected by narrow perspective of few years, you would say it's dangerous, I won't come.
Do you believe that God is watching over Israel?
Absolutely.
You believe that?
The fulfillment of the prophecy is every step you take in the country. It's hard to ignore it.
Scott Ross for CBN on the Golan Heights, Israel.
Coming up, a profile of one of the key players in the Trump administration's close relationship with Israel. One of Israel's greatest supporters during the Trump administration has been former UN Ambassador Nikki Haley. As David Brody reports, she played a key role in helping move the U.S. Embassy to Jerusalem and could be a presidential candidate in 2024.
Nikki Haley certainly draws a crowd, and more often than not, they adore her. Here, in front of thousands of evangelicals at Liberty University, she has the honor of being the most requested political speaker.
You just have to lay it all out there.
Haley's been very successful and a trailblazer, too. She was the only female executive in her first corporate job, South Carolina's first female governor, and when serving as U.S. ambassador to the United Nations, the only female sitting on the Security Council. After White House Economic Council Director Larry Kudlow suggested that she was confused about something that she said on a Sunday talk show, she knew her facts were straight and issued a statement, quote, "With all due respect, I don't get confused."
When they wanted to go basically throw me under the bus, I wasn't going to stand for that. You can go and you can say something and you can kick with a smile. You can do it without being hateful. and you can do it by still being strong.
As governor, Haley's Bless Your Heart strategy turned to heartbreak in 2015 after the horrible church massacre in Charleston.
It was probably the most challenging thing I've ever gone through in my life.
She attended 9 funerals, all open casket, and grieved with the families. And a doctor friend said she was suffering from post-traumatic stress.
I was in such despair. That was really a defining moment where my faith changed to an entirely different level. Because when you can't control what's happening to yourself, all you have left is God.
God had more plans for her, from South Carolina to the UN as U.S. ambassador, where she became one of Israel's most vocal defenders. In the book, she points out how President Trump's decision to move the U.S. Embassy to Jerusalem was not popular even among administration officials.
I mean, the president didn't have a lot of people that supported it.
She talks about 2 people in particular who wanted to thwart many of Trump's policies and wanted her help to do it. Former Secretary of State Rex Tillerson and former Chief of Staff John Kelly.
They were stalling and stopping what the president wanted to do because they disagreed with him on policy. That was when they tried to tell me they weren't undermining the president, they were trying to save our country, that I needed to join them.
Haley was a solid no. Instead, we find out through her book that overall she's been a solid yes on Trump. She loves the results he's producing.
What is your view spiritually on the sovereignty of God and what he's doing exactly by putting Donald Trump as president of the United States?
I think that God sometimes places people for lessons and sometimes places people for change. And you can look at everything that's happened, and I think we're seeing a lot of change, and I think we're gaining a lot of lessons from it as well.
So what about her? What will God do with her life going forward? She polls as one of the most popular politicians in the land. Could we be interviewing the soon-to-be first female president in 2024?
What I know is I'm too young to stop fighting. But I also know that 5 years is a long time in politics. I'm not going anywhere. I'll be around, and we'll just take it a year at a time from there.
David Brody, CBN News, at Liberty University in Lynchburg, Virginia.
Coming up, take a look inside the fastest growing church in the world. You may be surprised to find out where it is. It may surprise you that the fastest growing church in the world is in Iran. Yet that's the assessment of those who have seen and heard the remarkable story of millions turning away from the Iranian regime, Shiite Islam, and turning towards Jesus Christ. We've hidden the identity of the believers in this story, some of whom are Iranian Christians in another country. The image Iran presents to the world is large demonstrations with shouts of death to America and death to Israel. Those who have seen Iran from the inside, however, paint a very different picture.
You can't believe the images on TV because, for example, all the protests that you see in the streets, those are mostly contrived. There are young students in the streets and they've told us, if we don't go to the streets, we won't get our grades, so we're forced to go and protest.
We've hidden the identity of this Iranian church worker. He says there are 2 Irans, the one you see on the news and the other hidden from the world.
Yes, I would say there's a 10% Iran and a 90% Iran. 10% control the country in a more oppressive manner, hardline, religious manner, and then the majority of the people, 90% of the people, love America. They don't hate Americans. I think that's the message that Americans need to hear. They tell us all the time, we don't hate Americans, we love America.
He wants Americans to know that 40 years after Iran's Islamic Revolution, there's another spiritual revolution underway.
Awaken to the truth that we live in a time that's very special. More people have come to faith in Iran in the last 40 years than the previous 1,400 years. So there's a once, not only in a lifetime, but in history, where we have a moment where Iranians are coming to faith at such a rapid rate.
Frontiers Alliance International is producing a documentary called Sheep Among Wolves to introduce the Iranian church to Christians worldwide.
What's taking place in Iran right now is spectacular. It's the fastest growing church in the world that owns no buildings, has no 501c3s, that owns no property, that has no bank accounts, that has no centralized leadership, that has no denominational leanings, and yet it's multiplying like crazy. What the Lord is doing there is staggering.
And that results in intense persecution. that Thomas says leads Iranian believers to seek prayer, but not in a way you may think.
Typically the way we pray is, we expect that they want us to pray for the persecution to end. And they say, no, don't do that. Persecution is growing the church. When the persecution stops, the growth stops. What we want is for the gospel to spread far and wide and deep in Iran.
With Iran and the U.S. on the brink of war, Thomas says it's important to see what's happening behind the Iranian veil.
When Muslims from Iran come in contact with the man from Nazareth, something beautiful happens. And when they realize that they've been bought and saved and purchased with Jewish blood, prophesied by Jewish prophets in the Jewish Bible, something crazy happens, something beautiful happens, and that's what we're seeing take place in Iran.
Thomas believes one day the world may wake up to find Iran's church growth in the 21st century rivaling that of China and Korea in the last century. Well, that's an incredible story coming out of Iran. Well, that's all for this edition of Jerusalem Dateline. Thanks for joining us. Remember, you can follow us on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, and YouTube.